This is a video on warping two 36-inch dowels for a BackStrap weaving loom project. My sleeping bag got lost or misplaced, and I'm going to make a bedroll. I have written a pattern, one of my Simply Art Simply Basic patterns, for weaving a bedroll and blanket on a BackStrap loom or on a 20-inch rigid heddle loom. So because I can't find my sleeping bag, I'm going to make myself a bedroll set. And I started doing this yesterday, where I hung the back beam from a hook, and I was going to warp the loom going from the back beam to a hook the measured distance away and back and forth between the two. And because I'm not using traditional string heddles, I'm using a rigid heddle. Normally I can do that. I can start at the hook, which is about 6 feet away from the back beam, take a loop, go through the heddle, go around the back beam, come back through the heddle, and back to the hook. But yesterday the back beam kept moving back and forth, swaying, and it got very frustrating. So what I did today was build a frame. I made a very simple frame that you can see right there. It's got 3 stakes on it, and the back of the piece that goes across is just a piece of oak molding that you would buy really for your house. And to it I have tied a 36-inch dowel, and wrapped around the dowel is inexpensive aluminum wire that with that wire, what it'll do is keep the warp spaced across the length of the dowel while I'm doing this. And then on the ground, held by 2 rocks, you see a Kromsky 32-inch rigid heddle. And what I've done, back here is another support with another beam that has wire on it mounted to it the same way as the far side. And you see a cone of thread right there that I'm going to use as the warp. So I have sticks in place just to give me a little bit of room away from the support frame. And I've started taking from the cone of thread. I've come up through one of the holes of the heddle. I've gone around the beam, the back beam, and I've come back again, and I'm going to get a weaving needle, and I'm going to go through the next slot of the heddle. And I'm going to go back and forth like that until the entire heddle is threaded, and that will give me 256 warp ends on each end for my project. Okay, I'm now going to start threading the heddle. This, I'm using a standard weaving needle. It's probably a Susan Bates brand weaving needle. It's a little over 6 inches long. As you can see in the heddle, I've already come through once in the hole. Because I'm actually threading the heddle by hand, I now go through this slot right next to it. And I'm going to continue doing that until I have the entire heddle threaded. As I was doing this, I found that it's really easier to use double strand. I started at the other end of the loom, tied off one end, took a double strand up to that end, around the bar, brought it back down through the heddle, and as you can see, I'm tying them off. Doing it single strand, starting at the beginning on the other side like I did, you end up pulling one thread all the way through the heddle. This way, you're working from the cone instead of from whatever you've already threaded. So I start here with a double strand, go up through the heddle, around the other beam, come back, bring it to this length, tie it off, and then pull the remaining or the next loop off of the thread that's coming off the cone. Sorry, I dropped the camera a little bit there. So tie this off and then pull a new loop coming off the cone. I've tied that off, and here's the cone thread, which is underneath the beam. So I can go in the next slot, pull it up, and there's my loop to go through the heddle. Now I know this project is going to have fringe, so I don't mind doing it this way. You may want to do it the other way with single strand, one thread going through the whole heddle if you plan on twining it off and don't plan on having fringe. Now this end, which is the back beam, does not have to be tied off because you're bringing the loop from the other end, which is the front beam. This is the back beam. You go around the dowel, like so. And pull your loop, which is coming off the cone, and head back for the heddle again. This is working out pretty well now. You can see that I'm actually warping from the right to the left, and because I don't mind having fringe, tying off at this end, which will be the front beam, is working out fine because I'm not pulling one thread through the heddle the whole time. Another advantage, using it ends up being a double strand warp, and on some of this is Mayville cotton warp for rugs, and yet I find it frays very easily. So using a double strand will give the whole mat a better, stronger structure. And the other thing that's working out well is the whole heddle is going to be threaded. So when I'm done with what I'm doing, the heddle will be threaded. I can leave that bar right there on, I can leave the back beam right on that frame if I want to. I can attach my back strap to the front beam, and I can sit right here and weave. I'm not sure yet. I have a few different ways of using a back beam, so I'm not sure yet what I'm going to do with this, whether I'll take it off that dowel with the wire, or if I'll leave it on there. I'm not sure yet. But this is a fairly easy way to warp a backstrap loom. If you're like me, the traditional method of putting two stakes your warp length apart and crossing over by going around a stake in the middle, doing a figure 8, and then mounting that to the back beam by sliding a dowel through one end and a dowel through the other end for the front beam. I always have trouble with that, and I always end up with an uneven, loose warp, and I don't know why that is. So this way, everything is secure. What I do know I'm going to do is, when I'm ready to tighten the warp, I am going to cut the warp at this end. The whole heddle will be threaded. I will cut these and then do what they call dressing the loom. I'll tie them off in probably bunches of 10 to a dowel that doesn't have wire on it, and that will be my front beam that I can then tighten if I need to make sure the whole warp is the same tension before I start weaving. And then that is what I attach a back strap to. And then with the back beam, if I leave it where it is, I have to weave outside and roll everything up from the front beam. If I transfer it to another dowel and hang it, I can take it anywhere. I could even do that and then tie it back to the frame and work here if I want to. So I'm not sure yet about the back beam, but at least the convenience here is that the whole heddle is threaded before I'm done with anything else. And using a frame and a stake to hold the front and back beams in place is much easier than having everything sway around in the wind. And if you're using my pattern for the bedroll, the weaving pattern for the bedroll, and you decide to use this method of warping on dowels, then you need to double the warp requirements. Because the original mat that I made, I only used single strand, and now I'm using double strand. So you would double the warp requirements if you're using double strand. As you can see, I've got about 3/4 of it warped. It's sagging a bit because, you know, I haven't tightened it all up yet. But I've run out of the red and white warp that I was using. So luckily this is for me, and I'm going to warp the last part of it with a plain red. I'll probably be using a brown wool, either Blueface Leicester or Navajo Churro. I want this to be a mat that has a lot of strength, so I'll use a wool like that for the weft. So I don't really care about the warp and whether or not it really goes with it. I know it's going to show anyway. But this is a mat, which is kind of like a mat. It is a mat that you would put on the ground and then you sleep on top of it. So, but this is a lesson in, if you're going to decide in the middle of a project to use 2 strands of warp per hole instead of 1, you should have enough. Okay, I've finished running the warp on the loom, and I've decided that for the back beam I am going to twine the warp to my regular back beam for my BackStrap loom. And to twine this to a dowel, you see the dowel with my wire on it where the warp is. I'm just going to place the other dowel near it, probably up above it, just to show you. I'm going to use a darning needle and just a different color warp thread, brown in this case. And all you have to do to twine something is to use the thread to pick up the warp threads, tie them to the second beam. Now I had started over here and have some extra warp threads, so I'm going to start with those. You can cut like a 20-inch piece of thread, yarn. Just take it through the warp thread, like I have it here, if you can see it. I've picked up that warp thread. This will be down here. It's a little difficult to film it, all this stuff in the way. If I can get the dowel to stay in place. We're basically going to run the needle through each, balance that on my knee. Run the needle through each warp thread like that. Go around your actual back beam that you're going to use. When you come back around, go through the warp thread again, so what you're doing is holding it in place, and you're tying it to that actual back beam. And you just do that all the way across the warp. And then you're going to slip that dowel, the dowel that has the wire on it, you're going to just slip that right out of the way, and you'll have your warp twined onto your back beam. Now this is just one little section that I've twined, and you can see I'm just picking up the top part of the warp threads. They actually loop around the dowel, so I'm picking up the top piece of the loop and going around the upper dowel and then down to get the next top piece of the loop. There are two advantages to twining your warp to the back beam. One is that your warp is held right in place and isn't going to move around. It's not, that loop of the warp isn't going to slip. So once you get your tension set, it stays there. And the other advantage is that you can weave right up to the very end. I'm actually probably not going to do that. I'll weave however far up I want, and then I'm going to make fringe. But if you don't want fringe, you can weave right up to the end and have a closed end, because what you will be doing is cutting the twining off the beam and not cutting your warp. I'm going to do it differently, but especially with rug weaving, if you twine it to a beam, when you're done weaving, you cut the twining off, pull those little threads out, and you have a finished edge. Okay, I've finished twining the warp to the cherry beam, and what I've actually done now, before I remove the dowel that had the wire on it, I've put another beam here on the warp, so when I remove that dowel that's lashed to the frame, I will be able to pick this up, which has, you know, a string to hang it with, and take it right off the frame. I use two dowels like that because if you have to roll it up, or if you want to lash it to a frame, it's easier if you have the two dowels to wrap. This right here is what I hang it with, or on the front beam it would be the backstrap. If you wrap it a certain way, it holds it in place. So I use two beams like that. I can now remove the back beam from this frame and hang it so that I can tie off the front beam warp. And there I've removed the dowel that had the wire on it. I've taken it off the frame, and that is the back beam with the warp twined on and the second beam holding it in place. And now at this end, the warp's a little uneven in tension. At this end, at the front beam, all you do, take a scissors, because this is the way I'm doing this one, I'm not twining this. Cut the warp right across here, and then attach a left side warp and a right side warp to your normal front beam with a back strap on it. Put it around you, and then pick these up in bunches of 10 and tie them to that front beam, so that as you do that, all of your tension is even, and then you'll be set to start weaving. I've just done this very loosely before I go through and adjust the tension, but I'm holding my back strap, and you can see I've just tied the warp off in bunches on the front beam, and now I'll get in the back strap and I will adjust the tension until it's all even, trim any warp that's overly long, and I'll add a second dowel in front of the warp on the front beam like I did on the back beam, because again, it's easy if you have to roll it up. That second dowel keeps the warp in place. But that's how you tie the warp on, only in bunches of 10 instead of how much I have on there right now. And there's your project ready to weave once you get the front beam set with the tension.